December 12, 1942, 11:47 a.m. Kaiser Shipyard No. 2, Richmond, California. The rivet gun's pneumatic scream cut through the fog rolling off San Pablo Bay, a sound like steel tearing itself apart and being reborn in the same instant. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hoffmann stood behind the chain-link fence of the prisoner compound, hands gripped white around the wire diamonds, watching American workers swarm across the naked skeleton of a ship that had not existed 4 days ago. The smell of hot metal and diesel exhaust mixed with the salt air snizzle. And somewhere in the organized chaos, a woman's voice called out measurements over a bullhorn. Her words swallowed by the hammer of 20,000 rivets finding their homes in plates of welded steel. Hoffman had commanded a U-boat in the Atlantic for 19 months before the depth charges found him off the Azores. He knew ships the way a pianist knows keys. He knew that a cargo vessel of 10,000 tons required 8 to 12 months to build, that each hull represented thousands of man-hours of careful craftsmanship, that the launching of such a ship was an event of ceremony and significance. He knew these things the way he knew his own name. And so when the American officer had told him yesterday that the ship he was watching, hull number 440, a Liberty ship they called the Robert E. Peary, would be launched in 4 days from keel laying to commissioning, he had laughed. Not a polite laugh, a genuine bark of amusement that had echoed off the corrugated metal walls of the mess hall where the prisoners took their meals. 4 days, he had repeated in accented English, shaking his head. 4 days to build a 10,000-ton freighter. This is your American propaganda, yes, like your movies. Very entertaining. The other prisoners had joined him. A chorus of knowing chuckles from men who had spent their lives around ships and steel and the unforgiving mathematics of maritime construction. The American officer, a young lieutenant named Morrison with a Missouri drawl, had simply smiled and said, "You'll see tomorrow. Fritz, you'll see." Now Hoffman was seeing. The keel had been laid on December 8th at 12:01 a.m. He had watched the first plates lowered into position under floodlights that turned the night into a surgical theater of light and shadow. In the 71 hours since, he had watched the impossible become merely improbable, and then watched the improbable become simply true. The hull had risen from the waves like a steel cathedral, each section prefabricated in vast workshops he could see in the distance. Each piece numbered and fitted with a precision that seemed to mock the very concept of custom craftsmanship, where German yards would have 100 men working for a month. The Americans had 1,000 working for a day, where Bremen would have master welders making careful seams. Richmond had women barely out of high school running automatic welding machines that laid perfect beads at speeds that seemed to violate the laws of metallurgy itself. "They cannot be serious," said Kapitänleutnant Werner Schultz, standing beside him at the fence. Schultz had sunk 43,000 tons of Allied shipping before his Type Windsee went down in the Denmark Strait. He understood tonnage the way a banker understands currency. The quality must be terrible. These ships will break apart in the first Atlantic storm. But even as he said it, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that had not been there yesterday. Because the ship rising before them looked solid, the welds gleamed silver in the winter sun. The plates fit together with the clean precision of a machine tolerance, not the variable gaps of hand-fitting, and everywhere was the evidence of system, of process, refined into something that transcended individual skill and became instead a kind of industrial mathematics, where the equations always balanced and the variables were measured not in hours, but in minutes. Hoffman had found a copy of the shipyard newsletter in the trash yesterday, discarded by one of the guards. He had read it with the focused attention of a man studying enemy intelligence, which in a sense it was. The newsletter spoke casually of ways numbered 1 through 7, of outfitting docks where completed hulls received their final equipment, of pre-assembly techniques that reduced on-hull construction time by 70%. It mentioned, as though discussing the weather, that Yard 2 alone employed 48,000 workers across 3 shifts, that the yard operated 24 hours a day, that the average time from keel to launch had dropped from 240 days in 1940 to 45 days in 1942. And now, here, 4 days. 4 days from bare keel to a ship that would carry 10,000 deadweight tons of cargo across an ocean. The mathematics were obscene. If the Americans could build a Liberty ship in 4 days, even if that was some kind of publicity stunt and the average was 30 or 40, then simple multiplication produced numbers that seemed to belong to fantasy rather than reality. 50 ships per yard per year, 18 yards on both coasts, 900 ships, perhaps 1,000, each one capable of carrying the equivalent of 100 rail cars, immune to the bombed rail lines and road networks of Europe, able to deliver tanks and trucks and ammunition and food anywhere the Allies needed it as long as steel floated and engines turned. Hoffman did the arithmetic in his head and felt something cold settle in his stomach. His U-boat, in its entire operational life, had sunk 9 ships totaling 62,000 tons. He had been proud of those kills, had received commendations and oak leaves for his Knight's Cross. 62,000 tons, the Americans, if the numbers before him were even remotely accurate, could replace that tonnage in 6 days. 6 days of construction to undo 19 months of war. "Look," said Schultz, pointing. A crane was lowering the ship's wheelhouse onto the superstructure, a prefabricated unit complete with windows and instrumentation, dropped into place like a child's building block. The precision was absolute. No shimming, no adjustment. It simply fit. "Got him, Himmel," Schultz whispered. "They are building ships like Volkswagens." And that was exactly what they were doing. Though the comparison did not fully capture the scale of what Hoffman was witnessing, Henry Kaiser, the man whose name adorned this yard and 6 others like it, had never built a ship before 1940. He had built dams, Grand Coulee, Bonneville, Hoover, projects that moved mountains and redirected rivers, but never ships. When the British Purchasing Commission had come to him in 1940, desperate for cargo vessels to replace the tonnage being sent to the bottom of the Atlantic at a rate of 500,000 tons per month, Kaiser had looked at traditional shipbuilding the way a factory engineer looks at handcraft and had seen only inefficiency. He had seen men waiting for parts, for tools, for decisions. He had seen custom fitting where standardization could exist. He had seen art where industry could thrive. The Shipyard Newsletter, which Hoffman had now read 3 times with the intensity of a man studying scripture, contained an interview with a worker named Dorothy Miller, age 23, formerly a department store clerk in Oakland. She operated a welding machine on the graveyard shift, she said, and made more in a week than her father had made in a month before the war. "We work from blueprints that show every weld, every bolt," she had told the interviewer. "Nothing is left to chance. Everything is measured. They taught me to weld in 2 weeks, and now I can lay a seam as good as any man who's been doing it for 20 years, because the machine does the hard part. I just guide it." The quote had seemed like propaganda when Hoffman first read it, the kind of morale-boosting nonsense that governments published in wartime. But watching the ship rise before him, watching the systematic assembly of components that fit together with mechanical certainty, he began to understand that Dorothy Miller was not boasting. She was simply describing a system. The system had a name, though Hoffman would not learn it until later. Prefabrication and modularity, wedded to the assembly line principles that Henry Ford had perfected for automobiles and Kaiser had adapted for ships. In vast covered workshops stretching across 140 acres of reclaimed marshland, workers built entire sections of hull complete with piping, electrical conduits, and ventilation systems on floor jigs that held the steel at waist height, at angles convenient for welding and fitting. No crouching in bilges, no overhead welding in cramped spaces, no waiting for the plumber to finish before the electrician could start. The sections were built simultaneously, parallel processes that collapsed months of sequential construction into days of coordinated assembly. When the sections were complete, cranes lifted them, some weighing 40 tons, and placed them on the ways like pieces of a 3-dimensional puzzle that had been designed to have only one solution. Hoffman watched as a double-bottom section, already painted and equipped with valves and access hatches, swung through the air suspended from a crane whose operator sat in a heated cab 70 feet above the ground. The section descended with the slow certainty of an elevator, guided by men with hand signals and telephone communication. and settled into place with a sound like a vault door closing. Within minutes, welders were at the seams, their arc lights flashing blue-white as they stitched the section to its neighbors. In a German yard, that same section would have been assembled in place over a week, piece by individual piece. Here it took 30 minutes from crane hook to completed weld. "I have read," said Oberfeldwebel Hans Dietrich, who had joined them at the fence, "that the Americans are building one of these ships every day." Dietrich had been an engineer on a surface raider, a converted merchant ship that had operated in the Indian Ocean for 7 months before British cruisers cornered it off Ceylon. He understood logistics, supply chains, the calculus of replacement versus attrition. "Not this yard, all yards together. 1 ship per day." Schultz snorted. "Impossible, the steel alone is produced by American steel mills at a rate of 86 million tons per year." Dietrich interrupted quietly. "I have seen the intelligence reports. We captured documents from a Liberty ship that was sunk off Greenland. The cargo manifest listed the ship's own construction weight as 7,500 tons of steel. If they build 1 ship per day, that is 2.7 million tons per year, 3% of their total steel production. They are using 3% of their steel to build the merchant fleet that carries the other 97% to the war." The silence that followed was filled only by the industrial symphony of the shipyard, the screech of metal on metal, the bass thunder of rivet guns, the soprano whine of cutting torches, the baritone rumble of diesel engines powering generators and cranes and welding machines. 48,000 people were at work in Yard 2 alone at this moment. Hoffman knew, and Yard 2 was one of 7 Kaiser yards, which were themselves a fraction of the American shipbuilding effort. There were 18 major yards building Liberty ships, another dozen building Victory ships and tankers and attack transports, hundreds more building destroyers and destroyer escorts and landing craft. The numbers sprawled across his mind like an invading army. Each statistic a soldier in a force too large to comprehend. It was the mathematics of conquest by production. Victory through the sheer weight of industrial output applied with systematic intensity to every category of war material simultaneously. While Germany built ships in Bremen and Hamburg, the Americans built them in Richmond and Portland and Savannah and Houston. While Germany concentrated its steel and labor on tanks and guns, the Americans built tanks and guns and ships and aircraft and trucks and radios and uniforms and rations, built them in quantities that suggested a nation that had forgotten scarcity was possible. Hoffman had heard, before his capture, that the Americans were producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes somewhere in their vast industrial empire. He had dismissed it as Allied propaganda. Now, watching a ship rise from nothing in 4 days, he was no longer certain what qualified as propaganda and what was simply truth too large to sound plausible. "December 13th, said Lieutenant Morrison, appearing beside them at the fence with a clipboard and that same Missouri smile. "Tomorrow, launch day. The Robert E. Peary. Hull 440. Built in 4 days and 15 hours. Keel to launch. You gentlemen are welcome to watch from here. Should be quite a show." He glanced at Hoffman. "Still think it's propaganda, Fritz?" Hoffman said nothing. What was there to say? The ship stood before him, 340 feet long, rising 5 stories from the waist to the top of her masts. Her hull painted the regulation wartime gray. Her deckhouses white. Her 5 cargo holds and 3 islands visible in clean geometries of steel and function. She was real. She was possible. She was, in 4 hours, going to slide into San Pablo Bay and steam to an outfitting dock where she would receive final equipment and provisions. And in 10 days she would leave for the Atlantic carrying tanks or trucks or ammunition or grain. Carrying the material weight of American industrial capacity across an ocean to feed the war that was consuming Europe. The night before the launch, Hoffman could not sleep. The barracks were warm, heated by steam radiators that hissed and clanked with excessive American energy, and the bunks were equipped with mattresses that would have been considered luxurious in any Wehrmacht barracks he had known. The prisoners of war at Richmond were fed 3 meals a day, given access to medical care, allowed to write letters home through the Red Cross, treated according to the Geneva Conventions with a scrupulous correctness that bordered on absurdity. They were, Hoffman had realized within his first week of captivity, better housed and fed than many American civilians had been during the Depression, better equipped than many German soldiers on the Eastern Front were at this very moment. Even the prison camp was an expression of American abundance. Casualty thrown at a problem until the problem ceased to exist. He rose from his bunk at 3 in the morning and walked to the window that overlooked the shipyard. The night shift was in full operation, the ways illuminated by floodlights that turned the darkness into a kind of artificial noon where shadows fell sharp and black against the steel. Arc welders flashed like lightning frozen into continuous existence, and overhead cranes moved with the slow certainty of planets in their orbits. Lifting, lowering, positioning. The sound reached him even through the closed window. A mechanical symphony that never paused, never faltered. A rhythm as steady as a heartbeat and as relentless as time itself. Somewhere in the archives of the Kaiser Company, Hoffman would not see these documents until years after the war, when historians would compile them into books with titles like Liberty Ships, The History of the Emergency Shipbuilding Program, were the production logs that recorded every detail of Hull 440's construction. They showed that the keel was laid at 12:01 a.m. On December 8th, that the first hull plates were welded by 3:47 a.m., that the engine mounts were installed at 8:23 a.m. On December 9th, that the boiler, a massive prefabricated unit built off-site and trucked to the yard, was lowered into place at 2:15 p.m. On December 10th, the logs recorded weather conditions, shift changes, welding rod consumption, crane hours, man hours by trade, and specialty. They recorded that 16,000 separate pieces of steel were assembled into the ship, that 400 tons of welding rod were consumed, that 27 miles of electrical cable were installed, that the ship's triple expansion steam engine, built in a factory in Pennsylvania and shipped by rail, was tested and certified before it ever reached the hull. The logs showed something else, too. Something that would have chilled Hoffman if he had seen them. Hull 440 was not unique. It was not even exceptional. It was a publicity stunt. Yes, a demonstration of capability intended to boost morale and sell war bonds, but it was a stunt performed with tools and techniques that were already standard across the Kaiser yards and were being rapidly adopted by the other shipbuilders in the emergency shipbuilding program. The average construction time for a Liberty ship in December 1942 was 43 days. By June 1943, it would drop to 39 days. By the end of the war, some yards would be averaging 27 days from keel to launch, with individual ships completed in as little as 2 weeks. The 4-day ship was the exception that proved the rule. And the rule was this: American industry could build ships faster than German submarines could sink them. And the margin was not close. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had calculated in early 1942 that his submarines needed to sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month to strangle Britain's supply lines and force a negotiated peace. His U-boats had achieved that rate in March and April, sending 300 ships to the bottom in 8 weeks, drowning men and cargo in the cold waters of the North Atlantic with methodical efficiency. Donitz had been pleased. The mathematics. He believed were on Germany's side. Britain's shipyards could replace perhaps 300,000 tons per month. America's entry into the war would add another 200,000, perhaps 300,000 if the optimistic intelligence estimates were correct. 500,000 tons of new construction against 700,000 tons of losses meant a net deficit of 200,000 tons per month. Meant that within a year, Britain's merchant fleet would be reduced below the minimum needed to sustain the island nation's economy and military operations. But Donitz's intelligence estimates were not optimistic. They were catastrophically wrong. The American shipyards were not producing 300,000 tons per month. In December 1942, they produced 1.2 million tons. In the month it took Germany to build one submarine, the Americans built 40 Liberty ships, 18 Victory ships, 12 tankers, and 23 attack transports. The submarines, each crewed by 50 men who had trained for months and commanded by officers who had learned their trade through years of experience, were dying faster than Germany could replace them. 107 U-boats lost in 1942, 287 in 1943. The Liberty ships, each built by workers who had been store clerks and farmers and housewives 6 months earlier, were being launched faster than they could be sunk. Hoffman knew none of these numbers as he stood at the window in the pre-dawn darkness of December 13th. But he sensed them the way a man senses the approach of a storm, by the quality of light and the smell of the air. He had been at sea when the war turned, when the hunter became the hunted, when the advantage shifted from the submarine to the convoy escort, from the ambush to the defense. He had felt it in the increasing frequency of aircraft patrols, in the new radar sets that could detect a surfaced U-boat at 10 miles, in the growing numbers of destroyer escorts that accompanied every convoy. But he had attributed those changes to tactical developments, to technological improvements, to the normal evolution of warfare, standing at the window, watching the night shift build a ship in a time frame that mocked every assumption he had carried about industrial reality. He began to understand that tactics and technology were secondary. The war was being won by production schedules and welding procedures, by crane operators and blueprint readers, by the systematic application of industrial processes to the problem of moving steel across an ocean. It was being won by women like Dorothy Miller, who had never seen a ship before 1941 and who now welded hull plates with machine-assisted precision. It was being won by engineers who designed jigs and fixtures that allowed components to be built in parallel rather than in sequence. It was being won by logisticians who coordinated the delivery of 16,000 parts to arrive at the yard in the exact sequence needed for assembly, who scheduled rail cars and trucks and cranes with the precision of a Swiss watch. It was being won by accountants who calculated cost per ton and labor hours per unit and optimized every variable until the system achieved a kind of mechanical perfection where waste was measured in minutes and inefficiency was hunted down with statistical ruthlessness. The launch ceremony began at 10 in the morning under a sky that had cleared to pale winter blue. The fog burned away by a sun that offered light without warmth. Hoffman and the other prisoners were assembled at the fence under guard, positioned where they could see the ways clearly, but separated from the civilian crowd that had gathered for the event. Shipyard workers on their break, families of the crew, local dignitaries, reporters with cameras and notepads. A band played something patriotic that Hoffman did not recognize, and a woman in a dark coat stood on a temporary platform near the ship's bow, holding a bottle of champagne wrapped in red, white, and blue ribbon. Lieutenant Morrison appeared beside the prisoners with his clipboard, and that insufferable smile. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, he announced, checking his watch. Keel to launch. New record. Probably won't stand long. Yard 3 is talking about trying for 3.5 days next month. He looked directly at Hoffman. Still think we can't build ships, Fritz? Hoffman said nothing, but Captain Lieutenant Schultz spoke, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man conceding a point he would have died rather than concede a week earlier. You can build ships, he said quietly. This we can see. Whether they will survive the Atlantic is another question. Morrison's smile widened. Fair enough. Tell you what, after the war, ask around about the Liberty ships. Ask how many broke up in storms. How many had structural failures. I think you'll find the numbers interesting. He paused, then added with a casualness that somehow made the statement more devastating. Of course. By then, there'll be about 2,500 of them in service. So even if 10% have problems, that still leaves over 2,000 working ships. We can afford a few losses. 2,500 ships. The number hung in the air like an accusation. Hoffman did the arithmetic automatically. Helplessly. 2,500 ships at 10,000 tons each meant 25 million tons of cargo capacity, meant the ability to move the equivalent of the entire German merchant marine across the Atlantic every month. Meant a flood of material that would drown any defense through sheer volume. And Morrison had said it casually, the way a man might mention the weather, as though building 2,500 ships in 3 years was simply what one did when there was a war to win. The woman on the platform raised the champagne bottle. A shipyard official. Hoffman recognized him from the newsletter as the yard superintendent. A man named Lane who had been building ships for Kaiser for 18 months and had never worked in a shipyard before that, spoke into a microphone about American determination and industrial might, and the workers whose dedication had made this achievement possible. The speech was brief, mercifully free of the kind of rhetorical excess that characterized German official announcements, and ended with a simple statement: "I present the Robert E. Peary, ready for launch." The champagne bottle swung and shattered against the hull with a sound like a small explosion, and the ship began to move. It moved slowly at first, reluctantly, the way a sleeping giant rises, held back by the weight of 7,500 tons of steel, resisting the pull of gravity and the slick grease on the ways. Triggers had been knocked away. Hydraulic rams had pushed, and now only friction and inertia kept the ship from the water. The friction lost. The hull slid backward down the ways with gathering speed, the massive bulk accelerating like a thrown stone, faster and faster until it seemed impossible that anything so large could move so quickly. Workers scattered from the splash zone. The band stopped playing. The crowd fell silent in that instant before impact. And then the stern struck San Pablo Bay with a detonation of white water that rose 50 feet into the air and crashed back down across the deck in a flood that would have swamped a smaller vessel. The ship rocked, settled, floated. Tugboats moved in immediately, their diesel engines churning the water as they positioned themselves along the hull, ready to guide the Robert E. Peary to the outfitting dock, where she would receive the final equipment that would transform her from an empty steel shell into a working merchant vessel. In 10 days, she would be ready for sea. In 3 weeks, she would be in the Atlantic. In a month, she would be delivering cargo to England or North Africa, or wherever the war required American material to flow. Hoffman watched the tugs maneuver the ship and felt something inside him shift. A fundamental assumption about the nature of reality cracking like ice under spring sun. He had spent his adult life in the German military, had been trained in the virtues of discipline and efficiency and the superiority of German engineering. He had believed, with the certainty of catechism, that German quality would triumph over Allied quantity, that a Tiger tank was worth 5 Shermans, that a Type 9 U-boat was the finest submarine in the world, that German optics and German metallurgy and German technical precision gave the Reich an advantage that mere numbers could not overcome. He had believed that the war would be won by the side that fought harder, thought faster, designed better. But watching the Robert E. Peary float in her element, watching the casual competence with which the Americans had conjured a ship from nothing in less time than it took to train a submarine crew, he began to understand that he had been living in a pre-industrial fantasy. Quality mattered when production was limited by handcraft and custom fitting, when each unit was unique and built by masters who had learned their trade through years of apprenticeship. But the Americans had moved beyond that world into something new, something that treated ships the way Ford treated automobiles, something that applied the logic of mass production to objects so large that mass production should have been impossible. They had done it through standardization. Every Liberty ship was identical to every other Liberty ship, built from the same blueprints, using the same parts, assembled with the same procedures. The triple expansion steam engine was the same in Hull 1 as in Hull 2500. The cargo booms were the same. The anchor windlass, the steering gear, the galley equipment, the lifeboat davits, all the same. A crew that learned one Liberty ship knew them all. A spare part that fit one ship fit every ship. A repair technique that worked on Hull 50 worked on Hull 500. The standardization extended beyond the ships themselves into the very infrastructure of production. A system so comprehensive that it resembled nothing so much as a machine for converting raw materials into finished hulls with minimal human intervention. The steel arrived at the yards already cut to specification, each plate marked with codes that indicated its position in the hull, which section it belonged to, which welds it required. The cutting was done at the steel mills, guided by templates that had been perfected through dozens of iterations until waste was measured in pounds per ship rather than tons. The plates arrived by rail in the sequence needed for assembly, the right piece at the right time, eliminating the storage and sorting that plagued traditional shipyards where components might sit for weeks waiting to be needed. In Building Ways Number 7 at Yard 2, a structure that covered 14 acres under a single roof and employed 6,000 workers on the day shift alone, Hoffman had been allowed to observe the pre-assembly process during a carefully supervised tour the previous week. The tour had been Morrison's idea, part of some larger American philosophy about treating prisoners humanely and demonstrating the inevitable victory of democracy through industrial superiority. Hoffman had gone expecting propaganda and had found instead a vision of manufacturing that belonged to a future he had not imagined possible. The building was divided into bays, each bay dedicated to a specific section of the ship: double-bottom sections in Bay 1, side shell sections in Bay 2, deck sections in Bay 3, bulkheads in Bay 4. In each bay, the steel components were assembled on massive jigs that held the plates at precise angles, at heights convenient for welding, in configurations that allowed multiple workers to operate simultaneously without interference. A double-bottom section that would have required 3 weeks to build in place on the ways was completed in Bay 1 in 4 days. Built by 40 workers operating in shifts around the clock, welding and bolting and fitting pipes and valves and access hatches, while the section rested solidly on the floor jig, rather than suspended in the awkward confines of a ship's bilge. The completed section, 40 feet long, 30 feet wide, 8 feet deep, weighing 37 tons fully equipped, was lifted by an overhead crane and transported to a storage area where it waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, until the WWII was ready to receive it. When the call came, the crane lifted the section again and carried it out of building ways number 7 through doors large enough to accommodate a 3-story building, carried it across 200 yards of open ground to the way where the hull was being assembled, and lowered it into position with a precision measured in fractions of an inch. The section settled into place, the bolt holes aligned perfectly with their counterparts on the neighboring sections, and the welders moved in to make the permanent joints that would transform separate pieces into a unified whole. Hoffman had watched this process with the fascination of a man witnessing magic that he knew must have a rational explanation, but could not quite grasp. "How do you ensure the alignment?" he had asked Morrison, speaking in careful English. "Each section built separately, yet they fit together exactly. In a German yard, we would have fitters making adjustments, shimming gaps, custom fitting each joint. Here the pieces simply fit." Morrison had grinned. "Jigs and templates, Fritz. Every section is built on a jig that's machined to tolerances of 1/16 of an inch. The jigs are all built from the same master templates. So every double-bottom section built in Bay 1 is identical to every other double-bottom section built in Bay 1. And they all mate perfectly with the side shell sections from Bay 2, which are all identical to each other. It's like," he had paused, searching for an analogy, "it's like building with Lego blocks. Each block is exactly the same size, so they all snap together. We're building ships with Lego blocks." The analogy was crude, but accurate. The Americans had reduced ship construction to an assembly problem, had eliminated the variables that plagued traditional shipbuilding, had created a system where the outcome was deterministic and the timeline was predictable. They knew, before the keel was laid, exactly how long construction would take, exactly how many man-hours would be required, exactly how much welding rod and how many rivets and how much paint. They knew because they had built the same ship dozens of times, had refined the process with each iteration, had captured the learning and procedures and specifications that were followed with religious devotion. The results were visible in the production statistics that Morrison had shown him with undisguised pride, numbers that Hoffman had initially dismissed as impossible exaggeration, but which he now accepted as simple fact. In 1941, the 18 yards building Liberty ships had produced 112 vessels, an average of 6 ships per yard for the year. In 1942, they had produced 645 ships, an average of 36 ships per yard. The production rate was accelerating, the learning curve driving down construction time and cost with each hull that slid down the ways. The first Liberty ship, the Patrick Henry, had cost $2 million and required 244 days to build. Hull 440. The Robert E. Peary had cost $1.5 million and required 4.6 days. The cost per ton had dropped by 40%. The construction time had dropped by 98%. 98%. The number was so extreme that it seemed to violate basic logic, seemed to suggest that the first ship had been built with deliberate inefficiency, or that the latest ship had been built with corners cut and quality sacrificed. But Hoffman had seen both ships, The Patrick Henry in photographs, the Robert E. Peary with his own eyes, and they were identical. Same hull, same engine, same cargo capacity, same speed, same range. The only difference was the learning, the systematic accumulation of process improvements that had transformed ship construction from craft to industry. And the Americans were applying the same logic to everything. Morrison had mentioned, casually, that aircraft production had increased from 6,000 planes in 1940 to 48,000 planes in 1942. That tank production had gone from 300 to 25,000 in the same period. That the United States was now producing more war material in a month than Germany produced in 6 months. The numbers seemed fantastical, seemed to belong to the realm of propaganda rather than reality, but Hoffman no longer knew where the line between propaganda and truth existed. When a nation could build a ship in 4 days, what other miracles might it achieve through the application of systematic industrial process? 3 weeks after the launch of the Robert E. Peary, Hoffman was transferred to a permanent prisoner of war camp in the Imperial Valley of California, a place of desert heat and endless agricultural fields where German and Italian prisoners worked as farm laborers, harvesting crops that American workers had abandoned for higher-paying factory jobs. The transfer was routine, part of the gradual dispersal of prisoners from temporary holding facilities to permanent camps. But for Hoffman, it represented a severance from the daily evidence of American industrial power that had dominated his world since capture. He would no longer wake to the sound of rivet guns, no longer watch ships rise from nothing, no longer count the ways and calculate the tonnage and feel the weight of numbers pressing against his understanding of what was possible. But before he left Richmond, Lieutenant Morrison gave him a gift, a copy of Life magazine dated January 1943, its cover showing a Liberty ship sliding down the ways in a fountains of white water. The magazine fell open naturally to a photo essay titled, "Ships for Victory: How America Builds the Fleet That Will Win the War." The photographs showed the Kaiser yards from above, aerial shots that revealed the full scale of the operation. 7 ways operating simultaneously, each with a ship in some stage of construction. The vast covered buildings where pre-assembly occurred. The outfitting docks where completed hulls received their final equipment. The rail yards where components arrived in an endless stream of freight cars. One photograph showed Building Ways Number 7 from an angle that revealed its true size. And beside it a caption that read, "This single building employs more workers than the entire Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg. It operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and produces hull sections for one ship every 72 hours. Another photograph showed a portion of the stockpile area where completed sections waited for assembly. And the caption noted, "Pre-fabricated components allow multiple ships to be built simultaneously. Kaiser Yard." 2 currently has 7 Liberty ships under construction, each at a different stage of completion. Total workforce, 48,000. Average construction time, 39 days from keel to launch. But the photograph that Hoffman found himself returning to, the image that would stay with him through the remaining years of the war and into the decades after, showed something that had nothing to do with ships at all. It was a photograph of the yard cafeteria taken during the lunch shift change, showing thousands of workers lined up at serving stations where they received hot meals prepared in industrial kitchens equipped with commercial ovens and steam tables. The caption was brief. "Kaiser feeds 32,000 workers per day in 4 cafeterias. No meal tickets, no ration coupons. All meals subsidized. Coffee is 5 cents. A complete lunch is 35 cents. Hoffman stared at that photograph and thought about the German workers in the Bremen yards. Who brought their own food or purchased it with ration coupons that allowed 1 meal per day? Who worked in unheated buildings during winter and sweltered in summer? Who had seen their daily bread ration cut from 400 grams to 300 grams to 200 grams as the war consumed resources faster than the Reich could replace them? He thought about the U-boat crews who had survived on tinned food and stale bread for months at sea. Who had celebrated Christmas 1941 with a single orange per man, a luxury that had required diverting cargo space from ammunition. He thought about the Eastern Front, where soldiers fought on rations that would have been considered starvation in peacetime, where winter clothing arrived late or not at all, where horses died by the thousands because there was no fodder, and trucks sat immobile because there was no fuel. And here were American shipyard workers, civilians building cargo ships, eating subsidized hot lunches for 35 cents, while their government worried about keeping morale high and productivity up. The contrast was so stark that it seemed to belong to different universes rather than different nations. Seemed to suggest that the war was not between Germany and America, but between scarcity and abundance. Between a nation that rationed everything and a nation that rationed almost nothing. Between an economy stretched to the breaking point by 3 years of total war, and an economy that had absorbed the war effort as though it were simply another industrial project. Large, but manageable. The statistics Morrison had shared during one of their conversations came back to Hoffman now with the force of revelation. American steel production in 1942 was 86 million tons. German steel production was 28 million tons. American electricity generation was 230 billion kilowatt hours. German generation was 60 billion kilowatt hours. American oil production was 1.4 billion barrels. German production, even including the synthetic fuel plants, was 50 million barrels. The United States had 130 million people. Germany had 70 million. The United States had an automotive industry that produced 4 million vehicles per year in peacetime. Germany produced less than 300,000. These were not tactical differences. These were not the kinds of gaps that could be closed through superior strategy or better training or more advanced technology. These were fundamental disparities in industrial capacity. Gaps so large that they suggested the two nations were not really competitors at all, but participants in entirely different categories of economic activity. It was as though Germany had challenged the United States to a shipbuilding contest, and only after the race had begun, discovered that the Americans had access to resources and methods that made the competition absurd from the start. Hoffman thought about Admiral Donitz and his calculations about sinking 700,000 tons per month, and realized that the calculations had been based on assumptions about British shipbuilding capacity, not American. Donitz had assumed that the Americans would build ships the way the British built ships, the way everyone had always built ships, slowly, carefully, one at a time in yards where craftsmen fitted pieces together through skill and experience. He had not imagined that the Americans would build ships the way Ford built cars, that they would apply mass production techniques to objects that displaced 10,000 tons, that they would achieve construction times that made the entire strategic calculus of submarine warfare irrelevant. The U-boats could sink 10 ships per month or 50 ships per month, and it would not matter. The Americans would build 100 ships per month, 200 ships per month, would build until the Atlantic was so crowded with cargo vessels that submarines could not find them all, much less sink them faster than they were replaced. The war of attrition that Donitz had planned to win through superior seamanship and tactical innovation was already lost, had been lost before it began, had been lost the moment American industry turned its attention to the problem of moving cargo across an ocean. In the Imperial Valley camp, Hoffman worked in the fields alongside men who had commanded tanks in North Africa, flown fighters over Britain, crewed artillery pieces in Russia. They picked lettuce and melons under a sun that bleached the color from the world. And in the evenings, they sat in barracks cooled by electric fans and talked about the war with the careful detachment of men discussing events that were happening to someone else. Somewhere else. In a world they no longer quite inhabited. News arrived irregularly through Red Cross packages and heavily censored letters from home. Fragments of information that had to be assembled like puzzle pieces to form any coherent picture of the war's progress. By the summer of 1943, the picture was clear enough. The U-boat offensive had failed. Allied shipping losses had peaked in March 1943 at 600,000 tons and had fallen precipitously thereafter, as new convoy escorts equipped with advanced radar and sonar entered service faster than submarines could be built to replace those lost. In May alone, Germany had lost 41 U-boats. Donitz had withdrawn his submarines from the North Atlantic in what the German Naval Command had called a temporary redeployment, but which everyone understood was an admission of defeat. The Battle of the Atlantic was over, and Germany had lost. The Liberty ships had been part of that victory, though not in the way that Hoffman had initially imagined. Most of them had not been sunk because there had simply been too many to sink, because the submarines could not be everywhere at once, because the mathematics of replacement had favored the builders over the destroyers by a margin so overwhelming that tactics became irrelevant. In 1943, the United States launched 1,949 merchant ships, totaling 19 million deadweight tons. Germany sank 3 million tons. The net gain was 16 million tons, enough to carry the entire productive output of American industry across the Atlantic twice over. But the ships had done more than simply survive. They had proven durable, reliable, capable of crossing the Atlantic in all weather and all seasons, with cargoes that ranged from tanks to locomotives to powdered milk to prefabricated buildings. Some had been sunk by submarines. Yes, and some had foundered in storms. And some had suffered mechanical failures that left them dead in the water waiting for repair. But the failure rate had been far lower than anyone, including many American naval officers, had predicted. The ships built in 4 days or 30 days or 60 days had proven just as seaworthy as ships built in 8 months through traditional methods. The prefabrication had not weakened them. The standardization had not made them fragile. The mass production had not sacrificed quality. The Americans had demonstrated that ships could be built like automobiles without becoming disposable like automobiles, that industrial methods could be applied to objects of complexity and size without losing the essential characteristics that made them functional. Hoffman learned these things piecemeal, through overheard conversations with guards, through magazines left in the recreation hall, through the slow accumulation of detail that characterized prison camp life. And with each new piece of information, his understanding of the war shifted further from the tactical to the industrial. From the question of who fought better to the question of who could produce more, the answer to that question had been obvious since December 1942, since the moment he had watched a ship rise from the waves in 4 days. But accepting the answer required abandoning assumptions that he had carried his entire adult life. In November 1944, a guard showed him a newspaper article about the Liberty ship program. By that date, the article reported, the 18 yards had built 2,600 Liberty ships. Production was slowing now, not because the yards were less efficient, but because the need was diminishing, because the Atlantic was secure and the bottleneck was no longer ships but ports to receive them. Some yards were converting to build Victory ships, a faster design that could make 15 knots instead of 11, better suited to the Pacific theater where distances were measured in thousands of miles. Other yards were building attack transports and landing ships for the invasions that would carry American forces into Germany itself. 2,600 Liberty ships? The number was so close to Morrison's prediction that Hoffman wondered if the lieutenant had been guessing or if he had access to production schedules that projected years into the future. Either way, the result was the same: a merchant fleet larger than the combined fleets of all other nations, built in 4 years by a nation that had barely had a shipbuilding industry in 1939. It was conquest through production, victory through the relentless application of systematic industrial processes to every problem the war presented. The Americans had not merely outproduced Germany, they had redefined what production meant, had moved beyond the incremental improvements of traditional manufacturing into something qualitatively different, something that treated physical goods as infinitely replicable, something that acknowledged no practical limit to what could be built given sufficient resources and organizational will. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and with it came the slow process of repatriation, of processing prisoners and arranging transport back to a Germany that existed now only as occupied zones administered by foreign powers. Hoffman was among the last groups to be repatriated, not returning to Bremen until March 1946. Nearly 4 years after his capture. The city was rubble. The shipyards were rubble. The Reich was rubble. He walked through streets where every third building was a burned shell and thought about the shipyard at Richmond, which had been built in 18 months on reclaimed marshland and had produced 727 Liberty ships before ceasing operations in 1945. 727 ships from one yard in 3.5 years. The entire German merchant marine at the start of the war had been 4.5 million tons. Kaiser Yard 2 alone had built 7 million tons. The scale was incomprehensible. was beyond anything that pre-war economic theory had suggested was possible, was evidence of an industrial capacity so vast that it seemed to belong to science fiction rather than reality. Hoffman found work as a translator for the American occupation forces, using his English to help rebuild the administrative infrastructure of a shattered nation. In quiet moments, he thought about the Robert E. Peary, wondered if she was still in service, wondered how many Atlantic crossings she had made, wondered if she had survived the war that had consumed so many ships and men. He learned later, much later, after records became available and histories were written, that the Robert E. Peary had made 49 crossings, had carried 275,000 tons of cargo, had survived submarine attacks and storms and mechanical failures, and had finally been scrapped in 1963, 21 years after her 4-day construction, 21 years of service from a ship built in 4 days. It was the final refutation of the skepticism he had expressed to Morrison in December 1942, the ultimate answer to the question of whether American mass production could create something durable. But more than that, it was a demonstration of a principle that Hoffman had been slow to understand and slower to accept, that industrial systems, properly designed and rigorously executed, could achieve results that seemed impossible when viewed through the lens of traditional craft production. The Americans had not built better ships than the Germans. They had built adequate ships in quantities that made qualitative comparisons irrelevant. It was not tactics, but the industrial inevitability of numbers. The mathematics of production applied with systematic ruthlessness until the very concept of scarcity became obsolete. The war had not been won on the battlefield. It had been won in the shipyards and the aircraft factories and the tank plants. Won by workers who had been store clerks and farm laborers before the war and who had learned to operate machines that allowed them to build in days what craftsmen had built in months. Won by engineers who designed systems instead of products, who optimized processes instead of perfecting individual units. Won by a nation that had looked at war as an industrial problem and had solved it the way it solved all industrial problems, through standardization, through mass production, through the relentless application of organizational will to the transformation of raw materials into finished goods. On a clear morning in March 1946, Hoffman stood on what had been the slipway at Blohm and Voss and looked out across the Elbe River toward a horizon that held no ships, no cranes, no evidence of the industry that had once defined this place. Behind him, the city was ruins. Above him, the sky was empty of aircraft. Around him, the silence was total. And in his mind, persistent as memory and sharp as truth, was the sound of rivet guns and the smell of hot steel and the sight of a ship rising from nothing in 4 days, floating impossible and real under the winter sun of California, proof that the world had changed in ways that could not be unchanged, that industry had crossed some threshold beyond which the old rules no longer applied. The drop of water that had formed on the rivet gun that first morning, condensation from the pneumatic system freezing in the December air. He remembered it clearly, remembered watching it catch the light before falling to the steel deck below. One small moment of physics playing out while around it, the impossible became routine. That droplet, like the ship it fell upon, was both ordinary and miraculous, both insignificant and proof of something larger, that when industrial systems reached sufficient scale and sophistication, they could reshape reality itself, could make the impossible merely difficult, and the difficult merely routine, until the only limit was imagination and will. And America in 1942 had possessed both in abundance beyond measurement.